Come on. Windows lined up. These apologies. Okay, there we go. So I'm gonna, this is sort of a little bit of a presentation within a presentation, maybe within a presentation. And some of you I know have seen me talk about my block of graphite, which I've got in hand right here. That is also in that picture. And I regard my talking about that as kind of like a PSA. It's something that I think doesn't hurt for folks to see lots of times. It's a kind of important big idea, and to use a little bit of educationese and anchor phenomenon. So I want you to think about that question for starters, and I want you to think about whether it's this chunk of graphite right here. Again, graphite's pure carbon, whether that's got about a lot less than the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas, about the same, or a lot more. So we're going to come back to that in a few minutes, and I'm going to pour myself a beer while you think about that, because we are in the virtual pub here. So I'm having a Guinness tonight. So we'll get that going. You're thinking. And tonight we are going to talk about fear is our best hope. Maybe it'll play here. There we go. And we're going to see if we can move from climate anxiety to climate action. And the goals for tonight are to astonish you, to scare you, to give you courage and motivate you to act, and give you some tools for upping your climate action game. The basic physical science around climate change is well understood. Modern climate change is a real and serious problem. It's human caused and industry led, and we can do things to make it less bad. And another way of looking at what's well understood about it is that it's mostly caused by burning stuff. And I don't think we talk about fire nearly enough. It's not all caused by burning stuff, but it's mostly caused by burning stuff, and most of the stuff that we burn are fossil fuels. So there's a natural gas set of flames there in the background here. And so the basic physical science, again, is well understood. I think there are bigger questions in the area of social science. How do we motivate people to act on this? And how do we persevere when the future looks bleak? And that'll be some subtext for what we're talking about tonight. The sculpture there is called Follow the Leaders, though it's also often referred to as politicians discussing climate change. And I rather like that piece of artwork. The key idea for tonight is that fear changes history, and we need a good, honest scare. And we've had them before. Back a long time ago, 1983, the day after, was a made-for-TV movie that aired on November 20th of 1983. It remains the most watched TV movie in US history. Estimates put the viewership at over 100 million Americans, with a Nielsen share of 62%. That will almost certainly never be surpassed, because we have fragmented the media landscape so much that I don't think that's going to happen again. And it was a movie about nuclear Armageddon. I remember when it was on TV. I don't know how many of you all may remember back to 1983. I'm sure quite a few folks weren't even born then. And we're going to watch about 2 minutes of it. I'll note it's a bit of a spoiler alert, but then again, it's a movie about nuclear war, so you can't expect it to go very well, I think. This should play in the slideshow, but it doesn't. So I've got to bring you to here. And hopefully it'll load. And it's not loading. Come on. Okay, so we're going to watch a minute from the middle of the movie and then a minute from the end of the movie. And hopefully hit play when I click play. So that's a minute from the middle of the movie, and now we'll watch a minute from the end of the movie. Maybe. So this, when it plays, this will be the last minute or so of the movie. So again, spoiler alert, it's a movie about nuclear war and it doesn't end well. You'll hear the voice of a young John Lithgow who actually had hair in the movie. Jason Robards played a doctor at the University of Kansas, and this is him returning to his home after the bombing. And it's all set in and around Lawrence, Kansas. Full movie's on YouTube, by the way. And I think it's there legally.
Hello? Is anybody there? Anybody at all?
Yeah. So what does that have to do with what we're talking about tonight? Well, let's see if we can get our slideshow back. There we are. So Ronald Reagan watched that movie, and then he wrote in his diary this. He watched it a little before it aired on TV. In the morning at Camp David, I ran the tape of the movie ABC is running on November 20th. It's called The Day After. It has Lawrence, Kansas wiped out in a nuclear war with Russia. It's powerfully done, all $7 million worth. It's very effective and left me greatly depressed. So far, they haven't sold any of the 25 spot ads scheduled, and I can see why. Whether it will be of help to the anti-nukes or not, I can't say. My own reaction was one of our having to do all we can to have a deterrent to see there is never a nuclear war. Back to the White House. So he watched it, and then a little while later, he did this. This is he and Gorbachev signing the first treaty to reduce nuclear arms. And I'm not making the claim that he did that just because of that movie, but it had something to do with it. And I think we worry about fear. We're afraid of fear more than we should be. So America got a good scare there, and it made the world safer. I think we need another, and it's up to us to do it. And I'll note that I first gave this talk at St. Bonaventure University to kick off their St. Francis week. And I'm a little bit amused that they ask a heathen to do that. So a little God reference here. It's not God that we should be afraid of. So do we need to put the fear of God into people? Well, I think we need to put the fear of people into people, and also put the care for mankind into people. There are going to be 3 takeaways that we hit. This takeaway number 1 is being scared and angry is a healthy response to the state of the world. If you understand climate change and you're not scared, I think there's something a little off with you. Although you can move past the fear. I'm not suggesting that we wallow in fear. Do not take that lesson away, please. And sometimes it's appropriate to be scary as well, but be smart and kind about it. Honesty is paramount. Scaring is a start point, not an end point. And toss in some humor if you can. And here comes some suggestions on how to work on that. Or how to do that. And the word of the day is fire, which, as I said in the opening remarks, I think people ought to talk about fire more because people understand that. And as I also said, this is sort of a presentation within a presentation, and maybe within a presentation is kind of talking about why I like talking about the amount of carbon in a gallon of gasoline, using that block of graphite to help us understand that. So that was sort of my original presentation that related to that. And now I've added some strategy slides, I'll just kind of, those are black on black rather than black on white. I do talk about teaching with any audience I talk with. You're all deputized as climate change educators. The title of the last talk that this is within is what you would do. Part of the title is what you would do if you had one lesson to teach about climate change. And of course, one lesson isn't enough, but it's a start, and getting a start is helpful. And there's research that supports that. Getting a foot in the door is actually can be made academic. Hopefully the stuff we talk about tonight is true, important, and sticky. Otherwise, I ask you, what's the point? We're going to, a bit of education ease. We're going to use the anchor phenomenon of exploring what happens to a gallon of gasoline when you burn it, or after it's put into your gas tank. And if you want a good checklist for that, I will share a link to the resources tonight at the end of the talk, and you can get that. Some starting assumptions: most Americans are concerned about climate change, and most of us know it's real, it's us, it's a serious problem, and we can do things to make it less bad. But most Americans don't know that most Americans know that. And that's really, I think, quite important, and needs to be highlighted. And there's research that shows that. And this is, to take a common concept of peer pressure and give it an academic label. This is social proof. If people don't know that other people feel that climate change ought to be taught, and taught well in K-12 education, then they're less likely to go along with it and to support it. but it is a majority of Americans, and a majority of Americans in both political parties want climate change taught more and better in K-12. And another starting assumption is that scientific accuracy and claims based solidly upon scientific evidence are essential, but they're not enough to build durable understandings or to change the minds of those who dismiss the scientific consensus. Simon and Garfunkel got it right a long time ago when they said, "A man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest." Lie, la, lie, lie, la, lie, lie, la, lie. Good explanations are important, but they are not enough for most people except Bryce. Coherent storytelling does help. The most important thing we can do about climate change right now is do something about it. And I'll note that I've changed what I've been saying about that. For many years, I said the most important thing to do about climate change right now is talk about it. But hey, people are actually talking about it now. So we need to go to the next step and dig into something and try and do something to help the planet. And if you can, talk about what you're doing with others so that you both spread the word and get feedback on what you're doing to figure out if it's the most important or best thing that you can be doing within your capacity. So talk about that something. And I'll also, another starting assumption again is that we should talk more about our fire and our climate change education efforts, because most people know what fire is. Most people have seen fire. Nobody's really seen carbon dioxide. And are not really familiar with what greenhouse gases are. So go with stuff that folks are familiar with. Also, another important assumption is that climate change is hugely interdisciplinary and is best understood from a systems perspective. And schools typically are not very good at that. And we need to work at making them better. And there are some resources. And again, I'll share the link to the presentation so you can get that afterwards. And other starting assumptions will come up as we go. And I will also note that I'm trying to do too much in the allotted time. And I'm not modeling best practice if this was a course. It is decontextualized, kind of a standalone thing. And I think we ought to think about the difference in best practice for a 1 hour talk versus a 1 hour class period. So we're going to go through those goals again. We're going to look at one source of CO2. Americans burn 369 million gallons of gasoline on the average day. That's more than a gallon per person per day, which should make you say, wow, there's about 340 million Americans right now. So every man, woman, and child is getting more than a gallon of gas burned for them every day. I'm going to throw around some big numbers. So I want to briefly interrupt to talk about scale. And I think for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about this and not actually have you do it. I want you to place your marker where you think a billion belongs between 0 and 1 trillion. You can point to the screen to do that if you want to do that. I'll pause I'll take a sip of my beer while you think about that. Maybe just point at your actual screen and see where you go. And I'll show you a typical set of responses in a moment. So there is actually a thing to do it online, but for the sake of time, I'm skipping that. So everything goes in that first 1/1000th of the length of the line. Each one of those name numbers that we hear frequently, 1,000, a million, a billion, and a trillion, each one is 1,000 times bigger than the one before it. And, it's helpful to think about, to make it familiar and think about money, which we all have some familiarity with. The computer I'm using was worth about $1,000 when it was new. If I had 1,000 of those, that would be $1 million worth of old MacBook Air computers. You can probably picture $1 million house somewhere in your vicinity. And if you have 1,000 of those, then you have 1 billion. and 1,000 billion is a trillion. And here is what a typical set of responses looks like. Virtually every group I do this with, it ends up looking like that. With the possible exception of math teachers and math and science professors. But even there, you'd be surprised by how spread out their answers are, or maybe you wouldn't be, because maybe you put yours over on the away from the 0 too, obviously. And you know, I don't want to humiliate anyone or embarrass folks for not knowing that a billion is a thousandth of a trillion. We're not programmed to understand that. Human beings, Homo sapiens, have been around for about 300,000 years. And I think only since about the time I was born in 1963, did most people need to know about the difference between 1,000, a million, a billion, and a trillion. Now I think pretty much everyone does. It's really hard to wrap your head around it. It's not part of our daily experience in any common way, but there are ways to think about it. So a 1,000 seconds, another way of thinking about this is that time is something we're all familiar with. So 1,000 seconds is about 17 minutes. You multiply that by 1,000 and you get about 12 days. So 17 minutes times 1,000 gives you about 12 days. You multiply 12 days by 1,000 again, you get 32 years. So there are probably, maybe there are some people on this call who are not yet a billion seconds old. Aunt Mildred, who is here with us tonight, is now about 3 billion seconds old. I'm guessing she takes the prize for the most seconds seen. A trillion seconds is about 32,000 years. So each one of those, again, is 1,000 times larger than the one before it. And Homo sapiens, us, have only been around for less than 10 trillion seconds. Because like I said, we've been around for about 300,000 years as the species we are now. Those are examples of social math, and you'll see some other examples coming up, but social math is essentially thinking of real world examples of big numbers to help people understand them. And you know, another example of that I've used in the past is that the reflecting pool on the National Mall has about 4 million gallons of water in it, and that's about how much water it takes to frack a gas well in Pennsylvania. But it's also important to remember that the reflecting pool is only about 18 inches deep. So now back to our gallon of gasoline. We burn about 369 million gallons a day. Now maybe we have a better understanding of what 369 million gallons is. If I was live in person with you, I would pass around a gallon jug of water about 3/4 full. I probably filled it a little bit more than 3/4 full. And the reason I filled it 3/4 full is because I didn't want to use gasoline, and gasoline has a density about 3/4 that of water. So if I gave you a gallon jug 3/4 full of water, that would weigh about the same as a gallon of gas. And that means that if that gallon weighs about 6 pounds, that gallon of gas weighs about 6 pounds. If you use 10 gallons of gas in a week, 60 pounds of gasoline has somehow disappeared from your gas tank. And we want to figure out what becomes of that and what difference it makes. We, of course, know that matter can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed in form. That's some middle school science there. And in order to figure out what's going on with gasoline when we burn it, we need to know what it is. And it's not all the same, but it's a complex mixture of hydrocarbons, which are chemical compounds made of hydrogen and carbon. And on average, its chemical formula is C8H18 approximately. That's octane, which you see octane on the octane rating on gas pumps. What do you get when you burn octane? Well, you get carbon dioxide and water and energy, of course. That's why you do it. And I will also note that I use Apple Keynote for the presentation because I like the way it does animations better than PowerPoint. And we're going to animate our combustion reaction here of octane. And so we've got one octane molecule, we've got 12.5 oxygen diatoms or oxygen molecules. And there's our octane molecule. And now we give that a spark and things recombine. And so we went from one molecule of octane and 12.5 of oxygen to 8 carbon dioxide molecules plus 9 water molecules. And there are the carbon dioxide molecules. There are the water molecules. And when we look at those 8 carbon dioxide molecules, they weigh a bunch more than the octane molecule we started with. That's not magic, it's chemistry, and there's a little bit more detail in the chemistry than we're going to get into tonight. But what that means is the resulting carbon dioxide weighs more than the gasoline that we started with, because the reaction took oxygen from the atmosphere and took those carbons in the oxygen or carbons in the octane and combined them, each one of them, with 2 oxygen molecules or oxygen atoms rather, from the atmosphere. And you end up with burning a 6-pound gallon of gasoline, giving you 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. And that should make you say, wow, because again, we do that 369 million times a day. And that touches on the idea of surprise as a teaching tool. I am guessing that those of you who haven't seen this before are surprised that burning a 6-pound gallon of gasoline gives you 19 pounds of CO2. And surprise is fundamental to belief change. We can and should engineer surprise. Surprise generally indicates danger or opportunity or both. And there's an interesting book about it there by Michael Roussel, I think is how you pronounce that. And I will actually pause for a minute and ask you to share some things that you have learned by surprise. So just maybe 1 or 2 people willing to unmute themselves and shout something out. Anyone? Okay, all right.
Surprise is also the key factor in humor.
Say that again, Bryce.
Surprise is also the punchline of humor.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And there's some interesting research on humor and the role of surprise in humor as well, which I think is included in the book. All right, I will let you off the hook because I want to keep on chugging. There's a good interview with the author there that you can catch again by downloading the slides. So it's pretty surprising that a gallon of gasoline burnt yields 19 pounds of CO2. And we can pretty easily picture that a gallon of gas weighs about 6 pounds. But 19 pounds of an invisible gas is quite a bit harder to wrap our heads around. So we're going to do the using your mind's eye and think about a gallon-sized balloon and how many gallon-sized balloons it would take to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. So I'm going to ask you to hold in your mind's eye a balloon and think about how much it weighs empty, and then we'll fill it up to about a gallon size. So those are about the same size, close enough anyway. And think about how much that weighs now. Doesn't weigh very much. And think about some things that weigh 19 pounds or so, my larger cat over there, she weighs about 19 pounds. Her smaller sister, who kind of briefly made an appearance, is about half her size. A small dog, or the largest bowling ball is in the ballpark, and a 20-pound bag of anything is about the right scale. So how many gallon-sized balloons do you think it takes to hold 19 pounds of CO2? And of course, you've got to subtract the weight of the balloon itself. You're just thinking about the stuff inside. Anybody want to stick an answer in the chat? Take a stab at it. You're all so shy tonight. All right. It's about 1,100. So if we had 25 people on the call tonight, all of you would have to blow up 44 balloons apiece to get us to that 1,100. That's pretty tiring. We'll look at a virtual representation. That's 100 balloons. So we'll do that 10 more times. There goes 200 and 300 and 400. And I thought I had this working a little faster, but that's all right. 500 and 600 and 700 and 800, 900 and 1,000 and 1,100. That's a lot of balloons from 1 gallon of gas. And you can also think about how many balloons worth of oxygen it took to do that. So we again, when we burn that 6-pound gallon of gasoline, we get 19 pounds of CO2, and we do that 369 million times a day. That's over 7 billion pounds of carbon dioxide produced every day just from burning gasoline. Liquid transportation fuels, which is mostly gasoline, are about 1/4 of US emissions. So you got to multiply these numbers by 4 to get total US emissions. And that makes you say, wow. And again, you should be scared and astonished, and recognize that if we're honest about climate change, we will scare people. And that being upset about climate change is both rational, and I think it's necessary if we're to act. Why would we act if we weren't worried about it? So worry or scare or some associated emotion there makes very good sense. And I think fear is our best hope. And I think we have a moral obligation to be honest. Honesty in this case evokes negative emotions. The best way generally to address anxiety is to address the source of the anxiety, to work on the problem. And if you can work together with others, that further reduces anxiety. And I'll put a box on those last two because I think that's very, very important. Get to work on it and you'll feel better. Get to work on it with friends or make friends while you're getting to work on it. That's going to make you feel better, and that's going to make you feel better because it addresses the problem. So I want to be very clear again. I'm not expecting people to wallow in fear, to live in fear, but to get motivated by fear and then get busy. And I think virtually everyone understands at some level. I think there's some remarkable denial around this, but I think most people understand at some level that learning about bad things in history and in the modern world is fundamental to a good education. Like I said, there are some people who are remarkably good at denying that, but I think that deep down everyone understands that learning about bad things is important some of the time. And such teachings are also integral to most religious traditions. And I've given a talk on that before. It's also included in our teacher-friendly guide to climate change, which full text is free online. And it's worth noting that I know scores, if not hundreds of people working on climate change education and research. and every one of them that I talked to about it at least has been scared by it, and they've maybe gotten less scared as they've gotten to work on the problem. But everyone I know who is working in this field has been appropriately scared by climate change, and they're working on the problem partly because they're scared. And again, we should be scared, but not paralyzed by the fear. Fear can be good for you. You know, if there's something coming fast at your head, you duck out of the way because you're scared, and maybe that saves your life, for example. And avoiding or suppressing fear can be bad for you. And there's a good research article on that that had a nice write-up in the New York Times that was a little more accessible than the research article. And again, those links will be available if you want to follow up on that. So now back to our regularly scheduled programming. Is our block of graphite, our block of pure carbon here, is this a lot less than the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas? Is it about the same, or is it a lot more? Seeing how bad you are at class participation, I guess I won't push it too much to ask you to respond in the chat, and I will tip my hat. And I've sort of already done that because we've looked at the cartoon of the reaction that maybe gives you some idea. The gallon of gasoline is about 87% carbon by weight. So that means that a 6-pound gallon of gasoline has 5.5 pounds of carbon in it. And that means that that when I filled out the form to order my block of graphite, I filled it out wrong. I meant to order 6 by 6 by 2 inch block. And so this is about a third of the amount of carbon in a gallon of gas. So every gallon of gas you burn puts 3 times this much carbon out your tailpipe. Of course, it doesn't look like this because it's in carbon dioxide, which is an invisible gas, but it is this much. It is 3 times this much carbon for every gallon of gas. And that should give you pause and make you think about how to get away from burning so much gasoline, and thinking about what we ought to do to take the carbon out of the air that we've been adding to it since the Industrial Revolution, and increasing the amount year after year after year, almost every year since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Again, the simplest thing to do is not break something rather than try and fix it after you've broken it. But we've kind of broken isn't the right label for what we've done to the atmosphere, but we've changed it in some fundamental ways. Most important thing that we can do immediately is stop putting so much carbon into the air, but ultimately we're going to have to figure out how to take some of that carbon back out of the air. Simplest way to do that technologically is with plants. Wood is about half carbon by weight, and it's 45 to 50% carbon by weight. And of course, it depends on the species and stuff like that. To make the math easier, we'll say that it's 50% carbon. So if we want to take 5.5 pounds of carbon out of the air, 5.5 pounds is half of 11. So we need to grow 11 pounds of wood for each gallon of gas that we burn. And we can't let that wood rot or decay or burn, because that'll put the carbon back into the air. And we don't want to do that. So it just so happens that a standard 8-foot 2x4 like this one weighs about 11 pounds. So if we want to take the carbon out of the air that we put into the air by burning a gallon of gasoline, we've got to grow a 2x4 for every one of those gallons of gasoline that we burn. 369 million a day in the US. Wow, that's a lot. That's 4 billion pounds of wood every day. We are not doing anything remotely similar to that. That's almost 1.5 trillion pounds of wood being grown a year. I believe, I need to rerun my numbers on this, but I believe that means that we would need to double the forest area in the US for a year's worth of carbon emissions from burning gasoline. We're not doing that. We're not going to do that anytime soon. So we've got to figure out some other ways to respond to this problem. The second takeaway is to talk in ways that people can understand. So use relatable examples. Again, everyone's familiar with fire. Not at all true for carbon dioxide. Use social math. Toss in some humor if you can. This is and switching gears, as I'm going very fast, too fast here for a classroom situation, but maybe not too fast for this situation. This is a favorite graph of mine, showing US gasoline consumption over time by month. And I'm going to try and get you to say something here. So what leaps out from that graph? And the question I posed here is, how is this relevant to different disciplines? But just what's interesting? Somebody want to unmute themselves and say what's interesting about this graph? And we've got decades down here at the bottom. So the graph starts in about 1945 and goes up to 2022, I think.
It reminds me of the Keeling graph of CO2 in air.
Yeah. Yes, which is on the back of the teacher-friendly guide, and you can see that it looks kind of similar to that. So there's a seasonality to both graphs, which is kind of interesting. It's also interesting that the peaks are reversed. We drive more in the summer, so we're burning more gasoline in the summer, where when plants are taking more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. What else is interesting? Maybe one or two more.
I think it's interesting the effects we saw on climate from COVID, and you see that here in this graph too,
Yeah.
and yet it didn't really have any lasting effect, right? or not much.
Yeah, and not much, though we have not gone back up to where we were before, and we probably won't. So there is some good news in the world. We will probably never, I hope, never reach the peak gasoline consumption that we hit in 2019. And I think it's interesting that it looks different when it's smoothed out without the monthly difference. And that there is some good news. One is that gasoline emissions, when I first gave this talk, or when I first did that calculation in 2019, I think, we were burning 390 million gallons of gas a day, and now we're burning 369 million. So that's an improvement. But putting a little bit less carbon into the atmosphere is not really enough. But a remarkable piece of good news that almost no one knows, which I find really fascinating that almost no one knows, that this is that carbon emissions from electric power generation have fallen 40% since 2005 in the United States. And that's a huge improvement. There's complexity behind why that drop occurred. The simplest piece of the explanation is that we're burning a whole lot less coal. We are burning less than half the amount of coal we were burning in 2005 now. We are burning no coal for electric power generation in New York State. The last coal-fired power plant in New York shut down in, I think, February of 2021. So it's been more than 2 years since the last coal-fired power plant shut down in New York. And they've been shut down all over the country, both because of their environmental impact and because they're not economical to run anymore. They've been, the power generated by those plants have been replaced by a lot of it by wind, more of it by natural gas, though. And natural gas is still bad for the environment, but not as bad. You get about twice as much power per unit of carbon dioxide from natural gas as you do from coal. And you also have, it's generally cleaner burning than coal, so less mercury pollution and stuff like that. So that's some genuinely good news. Oklahoma gets 40% of its electricity from wind now, which I find absolutely remarkable, because Oklahoma is a huge gas and oil state. And Texas is the largest producer of electric power from wind in the country, though they are a very energy intensive state, so it's not the biggest piece of their pie. I think that's natural gas, if I remember right. So that's good news. And other good news is that more than 5% of the cars sold in the US and more than 10% of those globally in the last year were EVs. I think it's actually, I first made this slide 5 months ago or something like that, and I think it's actually gone up a percent or two since then in the US. So that's good news, although I think it's important to recognize that cars, no matter what their power source, are pretty horrible for the environment, and we need to not just think about how to make cars more efficient, but to make a transportation system more efficient than cars. So there is good news, but we need to temper that good news with reality and share the good news with caution. And that's partly because good news can reduce motivation for action. And I think the reasons for that are pretty obvious. If you think we're on the path to fixing everything, then you can kick up your heels and take it easy. And we're not. We've got, we do have some good news. So there's CO2 emissions in the US and the European Union have dropped substantially over the last couple of decades. Japan's dropped a tiny bit because they were more efficient than the rest of us beforehand. But when we look at global emissions, we got stuff to work on, and that kind of overwhelms that good news about Europe and the US and Japan cutting emissions. But and we won't have time for that. But there is good news, and there are ways that we're making progress, and we just have to keep at it. The takeaway number 3, and I'm almost done here before opening it up for discussion, is to take action and talk about it in productive ways. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, for years I have said the most important thing to do about climate change is talk about it. And I've replaced that with take action and talk about the action you're taking. Whatever you're doing now to help step it up and share it. And I think it's also important to remember that people do actually change their minds. And one of the things that helps people change their minds is the power of a good example. Share what you're doing. Don't be too preachy about it, which maybe I can sometimes do. If you're unfamiliar with what to do, take a look at the drawdown.org site for actions ranked by their level of impact, and pick one and get to it. And then talk about it that spread in ways that spread the word and the action, and give you feedback on how big a difference what you're doing makes. And then take that feedback to heart and ramp it up as you learn. So hopefully today's ideas are true, important, and sticky. Again, otherwise, what's the point? Dishonesty is not okay. It's kind of commonplace, but it's not okay. And in the long term, it tends to be transparent. So it's just a bad idea for lots of reasons. And you should be able to easily answer the question, why do we have to learn this stuff? And hopefully these ideas are sticky, and you'll hold on to them and share them with others. And I think, to think about the moving beyond climate anxiety. Yes, it is scary, but it also highlights opportunities to do invigorating and important work on the greatest challenges we face. And I think that's really exciting. A great example of that is the deep geothermal heat research project at Cornell, where they are hoping to replace the heating of campus buildings with deep geothermal heat, and that'll reduce campus carbon emissions by 40%, because 40% of Cornell's carbon emissions currently go towards heating the campus. And there are many, many examples of that. One example that I just learned about recently in New York State, in Rochester, the world's largest battery recycling facility is nearing completion. And I think that's very, very cool. It's a very impressive set of things going on there, where they anticipate being able to recycle 95% of what's in the typical lithium-ion battery. It's a company called Li-Cycle, Li-Cycle. Yes, it's scary. What are you going to do to make it less scary? And I want you to choose an action and talk about it with someone, and talk with the goals in mind of spreading the word and helping you understand how effective it is. And I'll close with a quote from Rosa Parks. I have learned over the years that when one's mind is made up, this diminishes fear. Knowing what must be done does away with fear. I do think that's a great quote. I also think that it applies whether what you are thinking is true or not, which is a little bit of the scary side of that quote. And so we've got 3 takeaways. Being scared and angry is a healthy response to the state of the world. Talk in ways that people can understand. Take action and talk about it in productive ways. And is there anything else? I'll open it up for questions and comments and smart remarks if you want.
So I have a question where I don't know if it's a question exactly.
Okay.
And that is, how can you translate this to how much the oceans are going to rise? Because it's looking really bad through all the glaciers. North Pole is essentially there. Greenland is the other place, and Antarctica is coming. If we could project that, I think, and just tell people how much of what countries are going to disappear practically. A place like Bangladesh, it's not going to be there, or most of it, and lots of other places, and how high the water is going to rise. Maybe DeSantis will have to decide how to swim.
Yeah.
Because most of Florida is underwater, and will be underwater, at least with current predictions. So it would be nice to sort of see if you could stick that in here, but I don't know how exactly to do that. Not in an hour, anyhow.
Yeah, not in an hour. And that's one of the using this as a launching point to connect to, yes, this is going to contribute to sea level rise. Particularly with the melting of the ice caps on Greenland and Antarctica, and with thermal expansion of water. As water heats up, it expands. Once you're above, 34 degrees, I think. So I would say that you can bring in the sea level rise in the next lesson, and the second lesson after this.
By the way, a very, very good book, and this generally is a novel called The Ministry for the Future by, what was his name?
I can't remember.
I can't remember now. He's a well-known he does near-term sci-fi. And you probably, if you haven't seen it, you really ought to. It's a novel, and it goes through what happens, in the next 20 or 30 years, and how people finally react in rather drastic ways and
somewhat sneaky ways.
Yeah, somewhat sneaky ways. Yes, like.
Now, what's the name of the book again?
The Ministry for the Future.
Okay.
And I guess it's not in my office here, it's in your.
No, it's in my.
I'm trying to remember the name of it. You won't have any trouble finding it. It sold a lot of copies and it's very grabbing. You read the first chapter and you just have to keep going until it's time for bed, and then an hour or two later.
Yeah.
It's a novel. I mean, it's a novel, and what people in the novel, what they decide they had to do.
Real science.
Yeah, it's real
And,
science.
you know, yeah, and speaking of novels, I think it's worth noting that the National Council of Teachers of English, the main professional organization for K-12 English teachers, has both a position statement and a book on teaching climate change in the English classroom. And we might have those guys do a workshop for us next sometime.
I
this
have
spring.
a feeling if I Googled it, I'm other things are happening in my life, so I don't have much time, but anyhow,
Yeah.
you can probably Google it and find out somebody's reasonable estimates of, you know, how much the ocean is going to rise, but I know it's many feet.
Yes, yes. Yeah, and if Ingrid was still on, she'd be able to talk about that. She had my colleague and the lead author of the Teacher Friendly.
I have a suggestion.
Yes.
Don knows that I like to measure things.
Mhm,
He's helped me measure eclipse,
mhm,
and I hope he'll do it again.
mhm.
So if any of you are interested in measuring, talk to Don more about it. He has a great visual sense. And measure something you care about, you see every day, and you can keep track of.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah. And one of the things that you can measure with some resources on our Earth at Home website is how much carbon is in a tree, and you can get an idea of how much carbon it's adding from year to year. And we've got information on, we've essentially got a high school level biology or environmental science or chemistry lab, if you recognize that trees do chemistry, lab on that, on how much carbon can a tree take in. And I got a question in the chat, in a direct message. What impact does how we landscape our yards have on CO2 uptake and storage? And that's a good question that I can't go into too much depth on, but turf grass, you know, your common grass lawns that you see everywhere, especially when you see them in places that used to be deserts, are horrible. Planting, if you can restore prairie in your yard, that's going to be better, because the root system will sequester carbon better than the roots of typical turf grass. And certainly I am guilty of having a yard because of peer pressure there again. Some of it is has gone fallow, is that the right label? But it's just kind of a wild mess, and it's better to manage it than to have a wild mess, although my wild mess is probably better at carbon sequestration than the turf grass. And if there are others who are more knowledgeable on that, they can chime in. Other thoughts, questions? Kip, go ahead.
I raised that question part because I read an article, I think probably from about 2013, maybe a decade ago, that soil will sequester more carbon when there's a good salamander population.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, that's tiny critters. And if the salamanders are out eating a lot of the small bugs and worms or whatever that are digesting a lot of leaf litter and detrital material, then if they eat the critters, then more of that material makes its way deeper into the soil without decomposing. And so you get an effect of adding some carbon storage to the soil. So whenever my neighbors are out raking up all their leaves, I complain that they're making it harder for the salamanders.
Yeah. 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 And wherever we've got burrowing critters, that's going to be helpful, I think. At least in certain ways, you might twist your ankle. And I'll note that we are planning an exhibit called Layers of Life for our nature center, the Cayuga Nature Center, that will look at what's sometimes called the critical zone, which is the from the bottom of the water table to the tops of the vegetation. And so we'll have stuff about what's happening under the ground. I am not sure of our timeline for getting that completed, but we've been drawing up the plans for a little while now, and hopefully we'll actually get that into the Nature Center in the next couple of years. And we'll address the
Sorry.
carbon sequestration in the soil. Al, another question?
No, I just said I posted the name of the book and the author
Great,
on the
Chat.
chat.
great. Let me put a link to.
Don, when you calculate the amount of carbon in a tree, it's not just pull up the tree and weigh it, because
Right.
the tree produces a lot of leaves. And so basically in the lifetime of the tree, you should also add in the total weight of all the leaves it's produced and have gone out to the street to be collected and hopefully composted instead of burned or something else.
Yes. Yeah.
One thing that I would like to see happen is to try to eliminate the turf grass that's growing along the sides of our big highways and in medians, which are mowed all growing season with gasoline using big tractors.
Right.
They're not always flat, so they're also dangerous to mow. And if the grass was replaced with plants that were more like ground covers, you would not you could eliminate mowing. I prefer not to have those slopes on the sides replaced with trees, like what's happening with the farm fields that are turning into shrubs and trees growing there, because then you'll get corridors where you can't get views out to the sides, which I think would be a big loss, even though it would produce trees. But if one could replace the lawn grasses with other plants, I think that would be a great improvement.
Yes, I agree. And it would also, trees also cool directly. So having a tree-rich landscape is going to be a cooler landscape than one that's grass and concrete. So that's another direct benefit. Other questions, comments?
Excuse me. Hi, it's me, Patrick. Thanks, Don. That was great. Awesome presentation, though.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say, yeah, about fear and stuff like that. Like, I'm out here in Schenectady, and my, I deal with a lot of situations like this. And really, I think about, like, I tell people, well, you have a choice. We can do it the hard way, or you can do it the easier way, because it is happening. And people have, like this last summer was just amazing. It started with wildfires and stuff like that. And, and it was visually there. And I think it got people a little more worried, at least around here. And I tell them, like, you can do it the hard way. We can do, honestly, what might even be a result of it now, like dealing with migration and displacement of people, resources, natural disasters, of course, and stuff like that. Or we can, do it the easier way and do that. And I think people react more to conflict and like other people coming in than they do the whole macro problem. They focus on like micro problems, so when you put it in their backyard, I think that they like, oh, I'm saying people are changing because all of this stuff and moving around and stuff, and if you don't like that, then do something about it, think about it. And that's all I'm gonna say. But great presentation. It was great.
Thanks.
Sorry about the audio there. Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. And a couple of thoughts in response to that. The professor I connected with to bring me to St. Bonaventure told me the story of the person who takes care of her lawn was kind of a climate change denier, but changing his mowing contract from 6 to 7 months and giving up on his snow removal business because there hasn't been enough snow has kind of changed his mind.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, did it
and
reverse?
also,
I agree.
yeah, right. And I just put in the link for a group called the Climate Resilience Education Task Force, which I'm part of, which is working on climate change education legislation in New York State. And we've drafted a model bill that looks like it's going to be introduced maybe by the end of this month. And we've met with a lot of legislators and legislative staff, and this summer was awful, but convincing to get people on board for doing things. So almost every assemblyman and senator that we have met with has been very enthusiastic about getting climate change education legislation passed in New York State. And I think the fires and the floods in New York City and the heat of this summer and the heat of last week have something to do with that. 87 degrees in October is crazy in upstate New York. Any maybe one closing thought?
Well, we talked about sea level rise, which of course is real. The trouble is, you get people, excited about that, maybe. And then you explain that, my God, sea level is rising 3 or 4 millimeters a year. And they say, huh? What are you talking about? 3 or 4 millimeters a year? Waves and tides and everything, they dwarf that. But then you have to consider this over a period of time. Since 1962, when there was a devastating storm on the Jersey Shore, and 4 people that my parents and I knew were drowned in that storm. Sea level on the Jersey Shore has risen about 1.5 feet. And then you have to ask the people who live there that are concerned, that whose houses get flooded, would you like an extra 1.5 feet? And some of these things make more sense when they're stretched over a period of time. But the trouble is with so many of these things is that a small increment doesn't sound like much, but climatologically, it can be very important. And just the raw figures, it can be rather blah, but they're important.
Well,
and the consequences of all these things are large.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it's a good thing that Washington D.C. is pretty close to sea level, because the tidal basin floods pretty regularly now. So it's pretty hard to deny.
I lived for 3 months on Haynes Point, which was essentially at sea level in D.C.
All right. Just reading a DM. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And there's one more question. Any estimates on the time needed to recover from climate change that has occurred? Those estimates exist, and it's a long time. We've put a lot into the atmosphere that is going to make the atmosphere continue to warm for a very long time. I cannot speak with authority on an answer to that question, so I probably shouldn't say more, but it's it's a great and important question. We are going to have to do mitigation and not just hope to get away from this by reducing emissions. We have cooked a lot into the books that we're going to be living with for centuries, probably, and maybe millennia. And on that cheery note, perhaps I will say good night. Thank you all for joining us tonight, and have a great night.